So we're on. So let me do this brief presentation of the seminar and of our speaker today. For those of you who have not been attended to the seminar series on corruption and impunity, welcome everyone. This is an event organized by the Center for Mexico and Central America and the Institute of Latin American Studies at Columbia University in New York, and the Legal Research Institute at the National Autonomous University in Mexico too. The goal of the seminar has been, throughout the 6 sessions that we have run through, is to explore networks in order to describe vast ecosystems where relationships and instances of crime and corruption take place. The series seeks to tackle the interdisciplinary challenge of discussing issues related to impunity with the aim of contributing to the definition, the measurement, modeling, and control of these phenomena and their impacts. In the last years, there have been several efforts to find better ways to measure corruption and to use more advanced methods that rely less on what people think or perceive about corruption and more about what the data and the facts show. So these methods are using big data and machine learning also to identify, predict, and keep an eye on corrupt activity, depending on where in the world is happening and what kind of corruption is happening. And this session will be about these improved measurements and how they help to better understand and take decisions about how to combat corruption in these specific spaces. Please, everyone, feel free to use the Q&A section during any time of this presentation. We will be having a first round from our speaker for the presentation, and then the queue will be retaking a debate and discussing your questions. So go ahead and participate anytime, please. And let me tell you something about Joseph Pozgai. He is a specially appointed associate professor in the School of Human Social Sciences in Osaka University in Japan. And he is also the founder of the Japan Network of Anti-Corruption Researchers. And I will use this time also to recommend his book. It was published in 2021, and this is the book of The Politics of Anti-Corruption Agencies in Latin America, which offers a very, very thorough recollection of the cases in Latin America and how these anti-corruption agencies have succeeded or not in their great objectives. So we're very happy to have you, Joseph, in this seminar. And well, the floor is all yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Issa. And again, I'm sorry with I would like to apologize to everyone joining today's webinar. You would expect that someone that has been organizing monthly virtual international meetings would be better at calculating this time difference, but oh my God, summertime, I guess, really threw me off. and it also coincides with the fact that I've been fighting a nasty cold for over a week, so I apologize for my hoarse voice in advance, but I keep lecturing at the university every day, so I should be fine for another 90 minutes. So I don't want to make a long story short. Thank you, Issa, for the presentation. Indeed, I am a Peruvian political scientist specialized in anti-corruption, based here in Japan. And over the last couple of years, I've been dedicating my research focus on measuring corruption through youth benefited from an award provided by the Ministry of Education and Technology here in Japan, but also collaborating in a couple of projects with John Jay College of Administrative of Criminal Justice, rather. So today's presentation is indeed I am to provide a broad overview about the state of measuring corruption, providing a bit of a background, and provide some new perspective, both from in analytical perspective, but also in the use of new technologies. And based on my own work, but also based on the work of many of the people that have been presenting at the series that I have been organizing, in which, of course, Issa also was kind enough to participate last year. So let me share my screen here. So you should be able to see my PowerPoint now. And is it in full screen?
We can see it. Yes, it's full screen.
Great. Okay, so measuring corruption, right? Measuring corruption, at least in our field, feels a little bit kind of like a holy grail, because it's really difficult for a field of studies that is focused on the political and economic transformation and increasing the well-being of society in very real terms, to not be able to really either accurately conceptualize what success would look like, how far success is from where we are right now, and where do we are right now to begin with. Yes. So measuring corruption is not just an interesting topic of research, but it has very real implications for a lot of people around the world. But we can differentiate basically the interest in measuring corruption from a research perspective and from a policy perspective, even though, of course, for research, we're very much interested in the policy implications of it. So a mapping of the anti-corruption field that me and Ivan Pastor, a colleague from Spain, conducted a couple of years ago, trying to see where the main what the main topics of research in the field were and how they had been evolved over the last couple of decades. We collected, we put together a corpus of literature of about 5,500 papers and publications on the subject. And we identify a number of topics, of course, including good governance, crime control, political accountability, many of them very much reflecting the disciplinary background of the researchers, right? So you have your common suspects there. Approaches basically focus on or being supported by political science, topics supported by economics, topics supported by sociology. And towards the end of the list, which wasn't a long list, we also identify an important body of literature very much focused on issues concerning measurement. When we started considering, however, the evolution, so we conducted a bit of a bibliometric analysis of it to see how the interest on this have been evolving over time. We found that it had reached some sort of peak around the early 2010s, but that after that it started somewhat declining, and that we would just expect, based on this data, statistically speaking, that it would continue to decline if we didn't do something about it, right? So what you're seeing here is that the top graphic shows the weight or importance of the subfield of measuring corruption, as calculated by the number of citations provided or received by these papers. On the bottom graph, you have the number of publications, which is just a sum of all the publications connected to the topic of measuring corruption in each year. So both graphs coincide in the point that that specific topic had kind of bubbled out, fizzled out. And that was very intuitive as well, because when we were discussing the results from this data analysis, indeed, in informal conversations and in conversations taking place at international conferences, it felt that discussing both the concept, or the definition of corruption rather, and how to measure corruption had become a bit of an outdated point of interest, right? There were mostly two positions. One, that it wasn't really that important because the statistics or the rankings provided by international organizations, especially led by Transparency International through their Corruption Perception Index, were good enough for our goals. Or there was the other position that mostly held that it was too complex, that there was certainly a necessity to discuss measuring corruption, but that because of the nature of corruption, it would be impossible. Perhaps at some point we could, but otherwise, many researchers found it a waste of their time and effort and energy to really continue discussing this, right? So this was a bit of an academic framework for the beginning of this decade in terms of measuring corruption. Very important in order to understand both causes and consequences and potentially to be able to evaluate policy approaches, however, limited instruments, as we'll see a little later. From a policy perspective, there's also a lot of value. Policymakers put a lot of value, not just in the measurement of corruption, but measurement in general, right? There's this classic saying that goes, what doesn't get measured doesn't get done, right? Or the converse, whatever gets measured can get done. Because indeed, we require benchmarks, we require the capacity to evaluate the efficiency and effectivity of our policy intervention. So we need to know the gravity of an event to know how money to allocate, and we need to be able to see if our investments are providing any return, meaning if we are on the way to achieving our goals. So from a policy perspective, it's very clear we do need measurement instruments. And as you probably all know, Transparency International Corruption Perception Index, even though it has been very well used by researchers, it really has always been meant only as a policy tool, but even more than a policy tool, as a political tool. Not because of political interest of the creators of the ranking, obviously not, but rather as an instrument for advocacy, to push governments to acknowledge the problems of corruption in their jurisdictions and to do something about it. So when the Corruption Perception Index was launched, it wasn't meant to be perfectly accurate. There's a lot of gray area and there's a lot of controversy, especially in the ranking of certain countries. But wide and large, it did provide a broad overview of the situation and was meant to say, hey, you know, these countries that are towards the bottom half of the ranking, you have your Jamaica, you have your Peru, you have your Indonesia, you have your Malaysia, you have your South Africa. You can do better. You have these other countries that are doing a lot better, many of them, of course, because of financial resources, but that is no excuse. And so provided this advocacy instrument for civil society groups to push for reform, right? So the measurement of corruption begins in these kind of like two sides at the same time. It's used as an instrument for advocacy, but at the same time, there's a real need in terms of research on being able to continue exploring the different dimensions of corruption. A publication produced by our friends at the IMF, well, that was this publication in particular where I borrowed this information from, was published in 2018, called The Measurement and Macro Level of Corruption, where they develop a new indicator for corruption, and they very quickly provide a broad review of the evolution of approaches in terms of measuring corruption. And they speak of three generations. A first generation dealt mostly with perceptions. This was the data that was most easily available. The Corruption Perception Index, indeed, at the beginning, especially during the 90s, they also relied on public perception, meaning in general citizen perception. That part of their data collection would eventually be just transferred to the Global Corruption Barometer. So we still, or rather, Transparency International still collects information about citizen perceptions of corruption. But then the CPI during the 2000s evolved to just focus on expert perception. So collecting information from different sources. The Corruption Perception Index is a composite index, meaning that it's not in-house collected, but rather they combine a lot of different sources that may not necessarily focus only on corruption, but include questions about corruption. So in this generation, we have the CPI, we have Control of Corruption by the World Bank, of course, being the second most significant index on corruption. We have the Global Corruption Barometer, as I mentioned. They also ended up inheriting citizen perception. And we have the Global Integrity Index, developed by the Global Integrity NGO, think tank. But it's not as, they don't produce these results as frequently. So by and large, we have the World Bank and Transparency International dominating this first generation. Then we have a second generation in which, well, very early on, we end up, we identify criticism or the idea of relying purely on perception, because perception can be deceiving. And they wanted to look at more empirical data, right? So here we find a victimization surveys and bureaucratic indicators. So victimization surveys follow the lead of perceptions, meaning that let's actually ask people about their experience of corruption. This is what the Global Corruption Barometer excels at. They survey most countries around the world. They cannot do it every year because it's a significant effort. They survey about 1,200 people in each country, and they ask them a number of questions about the contact that they have had with different public agencies. And then they ask if their family or themselves or anyone in their family have paid a bribe to one of these agencies over the past 12 months. So this gives us a much more reliable perspective of the incidence of at least a specific form of corruption, because the questions of the Global Corruption Barometer are specifically about the payment of bribes, right? Then we have, again, the Index of Public Integrity, now talking about bureaucratic indicators, as well as the World Bank Enterprise Survey. Now, the bureaucratic indicators do something completely different to victimization surveys, because what they do is rather look at trying to assess the possibility of corruption, but in terms of risk, considering that countries that have less efficacious systems for monitoring, control, and punishment of corruption, that most likely they have a higher incidence of corruption. So places with a weak system of administration of justice, places with poor practices of auditing, etc., then they would normally be expected to be more corrupt. And indeed, these indexes tend to have a high level of correlation with Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. Finally, we reach our third generation, the generation that we're experiencing at this point, that cannot be described in a very coalesced way, because they are very different perspectives, but by and large tends to rely on big data, or the multiplication of data sources, the availability of data sources. We have a really colorful group here, right? We have such platforms as I Paid a Bribe, that allows people to report victimization of bribery, meaning when they have been extorted or they have been requested to pay a bribe in order to access public services. And then they can provide specific information, not just about the public agency, but about the location in which it happened in real time. So it has ended up since its inception, collecting millions of reports of bribery. And it has been replicated in many other parts of the world. So now Mexico also had an experience with I Paid a Bribe. They can be found in Africa. They can be found in Eastern Europe, etc., etc. Then there is procurement analysis. I won't talk too much about it at this point, because actually there's a specific case of procurement analysis that I want to engage in later. But basically looks at public contracting and tries to identify red flags in process of procurement, things that may indicate that there are some irregularities taking place. And finally, we have news flows indexes, specifically the news flow index of corruption, also again developed by the team in the IMF. And I will also show you how a variation of this news flow index works later from my own work. But basically what they do is, instead of relying on perception, the idea is that they can potentially get closer to the original source of information by directly looking at the incidence of cases of corruption from news reports. The idea being that, especially for researchers who follow incidents of political corruption, most of our information come from news sources. And indeed, that precludes access to specifically micro and meso level corruption, but on the macro level should take away all the bias suggested in terms of expert perceptions, right? So again, I'll say more about this a little later. So this would become our 3 generations of evolution of measuring corruption since about the mid-1990s with the inception of Transparency International Corruption Perception Index. Now, it is important to keep in mind that any form of measurement, including the measurement of corruption, includes some exercise of power. Exercise of power specifically through the design of these measurement instruments. So there's also ample literature about it, and I don't want to go into detail, but I would like to give you 2 examples about what I mean with this. The first one is the inclusion, well-received inclusion of a specific target on anti-corruption in our Sustainable Development Goals for 2030. So specifically, we talk about the target 16.5, substantially reduce corruption and bribery. And as all other targets of our SDGs, they have been provided with indicators led by the UNODC and other experts around the world, right? So as you can see, it has 2 specific indicators to monitor the work being done in this respect around the world. Indicator 16.5.1 relates to the reduction of public bribery, and the second one is about the reduction of bribery, but in terms of relation with the business sector, the private with the private sector, right? So the first thing that we should note here, very, very early on, is that even though it is framed in connection to corruption, the indicators target only specifically bribery. And it doesn't really include a larger spectrum of what corruption really means in many societies, right? For example, lobbying activities, peddling in influence, right? Embezzlement would not be included here. I'll say more about this a little later, but the point here is that our indicator, our most internationally renowned indicator for monitoring anti-corruption efforts, only connect to bribery. The second example I want to give you about power dynamics is a little more serious. Transparency International has been criticized for quite some time because of the possibility of having certain bias against the global south, the developing world. Potentially, also in the way that they focus or they tend to provide, give a lot more weight to the incidence of bribery compared to the incidence of other forms of corruption. So to really express this, it suffices for us to look at measurement of other forms of corruption that are not included at all in the Corruption Perception Index, specifically the flow illicit financial flows at the international level. So on the right side, on the left side, you have the Financial Secrecy Index for 2020, produced by the Tax Justice Network, a large think tank that specializes exactly that on monitoring illicit financial flows. And they provide, I believe it's every year, this updated ranking on countries that tend to be safe havens for tax evaders and funds from illicit sources, including corruption, drug trafficking, terrorist funding, etc., right? So as you can see, many places that tend to be not just tax havens, but where many corrupt leaders end up parking their monies, are also found at the top of the ranking for corruption, for the Corruption Perception Index of Transparency International, right? So you have Switzerland, Hong Kong, Singapore, Luxembourg, Netherlands, United Kingdom, Germany, Canada, a percentage of the top 20 that are considered to be the less corrupt countries in the world, tend also to really embrace funds generated through corruption. And so the criticism here is when we normally discuss about the more or less corrupt countries in the world, we need to be clear in what we mean by the word corruption, because if we were to expand the terminology or expand our definition of corruption to include also the protection of corrupt leaders and corrupt funds, then potentially our rankings would look a lot different than how they look today. So the first limitation, of course, there are some limitations that we have been discussing today, but if we go by the 3 generations of measurement, we continue moving forward because no single instrument has been without criticism. The first generation was obvious. Perception doesn't mean reality. That is certainly clear. Experts may be biased. Experts may be capable of providing a deep analysis about one country, but be less sure about how that country compares to others, except just by the popularity or by common knowledge of those other jurisdictions. Or experts may be biased for their own jurisdiction or be overly critical of their own jurisdictions, as very often also happen across Latin America. If we look at surveys of victimization, the big problem is the same problem that was marked here with the SDG. Victimization mostly indicates that we're going to be relegated to measuring bribery, specifically petty bribery, and in many cases, extortive bribery. Petty bribery because the people that we're surveying is very unlikely to be engaged in corruption schemes at the highest levels of powers, right? Because we're surveying normal citizens. And second, that there's a lot more incentive to declare cases of bribery when you were extorted compared to when you colluded with a public agent in order to gain access to a public service, right? There's also the problem here that many citizens around the world may not be aware that some forms of reciprocity that take place between them and public officials are considered to be forms of bribery. So there are also issues here. Then the bureaucratic indicators, the most obvious one is that because they measure capacity, it is not just an indirect, but it must be considered no more than a proxy indicator, because the capacity to control corruption does not necessarily connect always to the problem. A case in point here that resulted from my own work with the Western Hemisphere Anti-Corruption Index is that in many countries around the Caribbean region don't seem to have very well developed systems of anti-corruption, but at the same time, they don't evidence largest levels of corruption as measured by frequency. So of course, the question would be here, and very much in Japan, that conversation also happens in discussion between public officials here in Japan and public officials from the OECD. The question is, if I don't have a big problem of corruption, why should I invest more resources in order to update my administrative procedures to follow best international practice? For example, is an anti-corruption agency always needed? Most certainly it wouldn't. It is expensive, it requires a lot of political support, and if you don't really have a significant corruption problem, the question is, why shouldn't you invest those monies somewhere else, right? So capacity, especially in the way that we measure it, should not be necessarily connected to the incidence of corruption. So what should be then considered to be a proper instrument of corruption? Let's say that for the time being, we are not dealing with the possibility of accessing different sources of data, but rather we're interested in what would be, technically speaking, the most proper way of approaching the issue. Well, everything, of course, begins with a definition. Right? So here, I won't go into detail, but I will be employing the most popular definition of corruption, which is the one that Transparency International works on, which is the abuse of entrusted power for private gain, which basically means that we have these 3 elements. We have the element of power, the element of abuse, and the element of gain, right? So there's some betrayal, to use some common parlance in this sense, right? Now, when you try to translate the idea of corruption, for example, to the criminal code, you'll find that many countries don't actually employ the word corruption in the criminal codes. And indeed, the United Nations Convention Against Corruption do not directly address corruption, but rather they decide to go specifically with behavioral terms. Because the problem is that if we consider that the element that connects or it stands as a bridge in our concept and our definition of corruption is that of abuse. Abuse can mean many things to many different people. So we rather need to translate it to behavioral terms to specifically be able to describe activities. And when we do so, we end up identifying that corruption is an umbrella term. Corruption means many things. It involves favoritism, conflict of interest, bribery, of course, embezzlement being another obvious and significant one, but also clientelism, impunity, electoral fraud, influence peddling, collusion, extortion, right? So it is actually many behavioral activities just packed all together within this larger category that we label as corruption. And if we start putting these behavioral terms, trying to categorize them or creating a typology of them, it is very possible to do so in a way that reflects typical criminological efforts. Crime typology has been around for a really long time. There are also typologies of corruption, but the question is, why do we develop these typologies, right? What you're seeing in front of you comes from a work, from the very popular work of Yen Yuan, which is a Chinese scholar, very much focused on explaining the economic success of China over the past decade. And she published a new book a couple of years ago called China's Gilded Age, where she begins with the development of a new instrument of to measure corruption based on this typology that you have on your screens. She calls it unbundling corruption, with this idea that corruption is not one thing, it's several things. And her point is that if you consider China is a country that is normally identified as being corrupt, or at least having high levels of corruption. But in a very popular comparison that she makes between China and India, normally China and India are considered to have very equivalent levels of corruption, but they have very distinct histories in terms of economic success over the last 30 years. So if corruption should be an impediment for economic development, how do we explain where China is now compared to where India is? So she tries to explain it by the fact that the most important forms or the most frequent forms of corruption in China are completely different to the ones that are most prominent in India. And that specifically in China has made a lot of progress combating certain forms of corruption, but the main forms of corruption that we can identify are that of speed money and access money, specifically access money, she says, right? China practices a sort of crony capitalism, in the sense that if you have connections to the government, you're able to gain public contracts. And the point, not the point, but one of the main ideas that she tries to make here is that some forms of corruption may be actually beneficial for the economy, right? She says access money, well, speed money has been theorized for a long time to provide relief from ample red tape. So in societies where there are a lot of administrative obstacles in order to engage in enterprising, a little bit of speed money, a bribe, could spur economic growth. And the same happens for access money only at the elite level, right? So it's very different to engage in bribery in a way that goes hand in hand with certain levels of economic development compared to just embezzlement or theft, in which it's not just an inefficient allocation of resources, but it's just an extraction of resources that affects both citizens and the public purse. Now, because we are able to identify different forms of corruption, potentially having different actors, different incidents, different agencies involved, we can also consider that if we have a toolkit, and we do have a toolkit of anti-corruption actions has been produced, there are many of these type of handbooks developed by the UNODC from the beginning of the 2000s. For example, transparency, monitoring, increasing punishment, integrity reforms, focusing more on integrity activities for public servants. There are many different actions that we can engage in. But because we have scarce resources, we need to decide which type of reform to engage in. So if we are able to identify the type of corruption that we're interested in combating, we should also be able to pair it with some specific reforms. Now, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, one of the points of UNAM was that we cannot, it's not just a matter of differentiating forms of corruption by actors, but that some forms of corruption may actually be positive for economic development given current circumstances. She doesn't say that in the long term this will continue to be the case, but she said that right now this has been the case. Okay? So here we can also discuss what different forms of corruption mean for economic development, but what do they also mean for the moral integrity of societies? Yeah, I will say a lot more about this a little later, but just to help this idea land, let us remember, for example, during the administration of American President Donald Trump, right? A number of his family members were involved in political activities in the White House, and they were assigned to positions in important policy areas, right? Such sort of activity in many other countries around the world would be a criminal case of nepotism, right? However, in American politics, that is not legal, but that is very common, right? Because in the American political system, when a party wins the elections, it is accepted that a certain percentage of public posts will be allocated for the party that won those elections, right? So kind of like a reward for coming on top, right? To the victor goes the spoils. So political spoils have a history of being better accepted in the US comparing to other countries. Even in Peru, such a case of nepotism would most likely initiate a criminal investigation about the political leaders. However, when we talk in general terms of corruption, certainly the US is not as corrupt as Peru. But then this suggests that certain forms of corruption, even if not the overall state of corruption, but certain forms, certain behavioral activities are better accepted and maybe even embedded in what is permissible in the society that we're considering. So this should also at some point be introduced in our measurement instruments, and I will show you how later. Now, I will take a few steps back, and I will revisit 3 specific examples about what it means to measure corruption using past approaches, but using new techniques and new data. And then I'm going to move forward to discussing new sources of data as well. The first one relates to a project, the one that I mentioned in collaboration with John Jay College of Criminal Justice, which was published around June of last year, called the Western Hemisphere Anti-Corruption Index Report 2022. So what we wanted to do was to evaluate the level of implementation of international anti-corruption conventions across the Americas. At that point, excluding the US and Canada, although those 2 countries are being incorporated right now as we speak. So the international conventions that we were focusing on were, of course, the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption, the OECD Convention for those countries for which it was applicable, and finally the United Conventions Against Corruption, right, the UNCAC. The first thing is that if we start from a point of implementation, luckily, of course, conventions already do a lot of the heavy lifting for us in 2 senses. One is the analytical sense of being able to divide the specific anti-corruption actions by articles within that convention. The first step then needed to be how to integrate the 3 conventions into a way that made sense, right? Because there's a lot of overlapping. There's no perfect overlapping among the 3, but there is a significant amount of overlapping. To my surprise, there was only 1 paper in the past that had tried to do this, but it wasn't comprehensive. So what we did is establish taking the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption as a template, because it did come first, and it was actually quite important, especially for its time. We took that as a template and then started comparing the equivalence of articles within that convention and that of the UNCAC. Of course, UNCAC was a lot more comprehensive and detailed. So as you can see, for any single article in the Inter-American Convention, we have a number of articles covering the same topic in the United Nations Convention. And then we did the same for the OECD one. Then it was a matter of how do we address levels of implementation of any one single article, right? Because signing on to the convention can be politically important, but doesn't mean anything for the reduction of corruption. Signing a law doesn't do much for reducing corruption. Yes, and of course, even when we look at enforcement, many deficiencies with enforcement, especially with the capacity to win prosecutions, stem from weakness on the design side. But a perfectly designed policy will also not get you anywhere if you don't have the proper budget and human resources to enforce it effectively, right? So we have these three major dimensions that we wanted to work with, and that provided us an entry to the identification of indicators. As you see here, we would then be measuring the level of progress made in terms of creating a proper decree or law, responding to those commitments to the anti-corruption conventions. We're going to be looking at the scope of those decrees or laws, both in geographical terms, hierarchical terms. For example, in many cases, instruments for making transparent conflict of interest would not cover the entirety of the public sector, right? There are certain privileges that are allowed to certain political actors, for example. Then we need to see if there are mechanisms for monitoring of such procedures. Then we look at enforcement in terms of integrity, and most importantly, usually resources. And we score each one of these indicators based on the materials provided by the conventions through their monitoring mechanism. The most popular one being the Inter-American Convention mechanism, the MESICIC, the mechanism for the follow-up of the Inter-American Convention Against Corruption. That was the earliest one. Now we also have the UNCAC mechanism. And so we canvassed about 50,000 pages of information trying to identify progress. Now, it is important to understand how we measure progress, because every system is very different, and conventions are meant to be adapted to local realities in terms of the legal framework of the country, right? So it didn't make a lot of sense for us to give points if certain actions were executed, but rather we wanted to start from that theoretical premise that everyone did perfectly, and then take points away as the reviewers identify problem areas in terms of adoption, design of enforcement. So that way, we would score their actions based on the legal realities of every country. And that's how we ended up with results that provided very disaggregated information, not just at the level of specific anti-corruption policies, as reflected in the international conventions, but also about the specific problems within each one of these policies in terms of how were they doing in terms of adoption, design, enforcement. And when grouped together, most conventions group these articles between prevention, criminalization, and international cooperation. We can have also a better idea of what general areas of anti-corruption work do countries tend to do better or worse. And we have this information for, again, all countries in the Americas, except for the US and Canada for the time being. The ranking that we ended up looked like this, with countries coming at the top being the Costa Rica, Argentina, Colombia, Peru, Brazil, Chile, Brazil, Mexico. So some surprises there. It wasn't surprising to find Costa Rica there, but it was surprising not to have Uruguay. It was surprising to have Peru ahead of Chile. But here is, for me, what makes perfect sense, right? That we're not looking, again, at corruption proper. We're looking at anti-corruption system. We're looking at anti-corruption systems in a more systematic way, yeah, and in a way that could be reproduced. However, having anti-corruption policies in place doesn't mean that you're being necessarily effective. Now, for those of you that like to find correlation between rankings, you will potentially see that all members or observer members of the OECD convention are also here at the top of the ranking, right? So to me, that did not surprise me. The fact that many countries would put a lot of effort in developing anti-corruption mechanisms just to justify their participation in the OECD, regardless of the level of actual effectivity of these mechanisms. Yeah. So there's a lot more history that can be said about this ranking, but I just wanted to give you a quick look about how it looked. All right. Now, yes, we have a number of instruments or a number of policies or mechanisms to control different forms of corruption. But are we controlling the forms of corruption that we are most interested in controlling? And this is another important question. There are two classic ways in which we could start to think in this way of typologies, either in terms of cost, monetary consequences, but because corruption, historically speaking, started from a moral perspective, I would also like to start there and talk a little bit about or trying to answer the question, are different types of corruption tolerated differently from a moral and ethical perspective? The information that I'm showing here comes from a paper that is being right now written between myself and Issa, a colleague that has been working on anti-corruption for a long time as well. And what we wanted to do is we wanted to see if some exemplar cases of corruption representing different behavioral forms, such as bribery involving traffic police agents, cases of nepotism, cases of state capture, patronage, embezzlement, if they would mean different things to people, not in terms of how they are interpreted, but the moral weight or the moral value of them. So here, let me show you some preliminary results of that. Excuse me 1 minute. Okay. So we conducted an online survey of a few hundred individuals in each one of these countries. We cover 6 countries, 2 in Latin America, 2 in Europe, 2 in Asia. We wanted to do it this way to reflect different cultural backgrounds. So we have Indonesia and India in Asia, we have Romania and Spain in Europe, and we have Brazil and Mexico in Latin America. So generally speaking, we can rank these countries based on general tolerance of corruption, okay, across all vignettes, with Spain coming as the country with the least level of tolerance, and Indonesia coming at the highest level of tolerance. But it is a lot more powerful to look what specific forms of corruption are each one of these countries less tolerant of. So, not surprisingly, most countries find embezzlement the most intolerant form of corruption, because it's outright theft, and in this specific case was described to taking place in the public sector. So, theft of public resources. On the other hand, patronage seems to be quite okay, potentially because of the benefit that incurred to the citizens, or the idea that even if we live in a democracy, people's material experience should also benefit from political activity. So there are different ways of interpreting, but I would like to, as an example, to bring your attention to the specific case of bribery in an office environment that it mostly reflected an office in the private sector. Yeah. So we have Spain, which is the bottom blue dashed line, and we see that Spain is consistently less tolerant than other countries concerning most forms of corruption. But when it comes to bribery in an office environment, all of a sudden, there was a lot more tolerance to that specific form of corruption. And conversely, India, that was a lot more tolerant, became intolerant, or a little more intolerant of that specific form, so that actually Indians or Indian citizens tolerate less bribery taking place in an office environment compared to people in Spain. Now, this is very descriptive, but does it actually have a statistical significance? The answer is yes. So let me show you here. I replotted this graph, but only keeping those results that were statistically significant. And I'm expressing them in terms of also ratio, meaning the increased probability that you will express tolerance or intolerance compared to the reference case of Spain, right? So as you see, the dashed line is at the bottom, is at 1, meaning that that's the one that remains stable, and we're comparing the results from other countries to that of Spanish citizens. In the case of state capture, Romania, that wasn't necessarily one of the most tolerant of corruption, becomes almost 9 times more tolerant of cases of state capture compared to people in Spain. Conversely, a majority of countries tend to be in statistically significant terms less tolerant of bribery in an office environment compared to people in Spain. So there are real differences here. Depending on the form of corruption that we are focusing on measuring, regardless of its monetary value, some societies may find it more acceptable than others. And if we are going to use this to inform strategies, both strategies but also priority for policy instruments, shouldn't we then focus on tackling those forms of corruption that our people find to be most intolerant? And that was the objective of this research exercise, to show that it's not just the corruption in an umbrella term, but when we talk about tolerating or accepting corruption, we need to be specific about the behavioral form that we're describing. Because potentially, if we only continue talking about bribery of public officials and we don't talk about money laundering, then we will forever consider to be our countries in the global south to be a lot more corrupt than people in other parts of the world. And normally that involves also moral self-hatred, right? We consider ourselves, oh, our societies are so violent, so corrupt. There's something wrong with us. And the reality is that may not necessarily be true, but rather the fact that we continue focusing on our flaws, and our flaws become the standard flaws that everyone should be thinking about. Well, now let me move on to, I'm sorry, Issa, do I still have some time? How much time do I have?
Of course, you can use another 10 minutes, 15.
Okay, thank you. Then I'll get on going, because I have some new tools that I also wanted to show you. Okay, so let me say now about the usage of news, right? Tracking of news of corruption to establish baselines for the incidence of corruption across jurisdictions. There have been a couple of papers over the last 10 years trying to use this approach and cutting corners by using Google Trends, with the idea that specifically in moments where we are experiencing corruption scandals, think about your Odebrecht, for example, or your Siemens scandal, etc., that people in the country where this scandal is taking place will be discussing it a lot, and that it should be represented, it should be reflected in the type of search of people as reflected in Google Trends, right? So to give you an idea of how that would look like, we are comparing here Canada with Jamaica, right? Jamaica being represented by the red line and Canada being represented by the blue line. And this shows the importance of certain terms of search at an everyday basis. So by and large, Canada seems to have a higher level of interest or be more involved in internet discussions about corruption compared to Canadians, although the frequency is very irregular. That may be because of some issues with the collection of data. But this has been an approach that has been tried, as I mentioned, a couple of times over the past decade. A more advanced one was the one taken over by the people at the IMF. They They did not consider Google Trends to be reliable. They instead relied on an international repository of news, news specifically in English. They divided those news by country, by country connected. For example, even though it's a news from the BBC, but discussing the Odebrecht case in Brazil, the news would be labeled as being about Brazil, right? And then they filter all news to keep only the ones related to corruption using a keyword search. And they were able to identify these moments in time in which certain scandals of corruption create these peaks, right? Of frequency of news about corruption seen over time, right? So as you can see here, for example, at some point, news spike in country A because of some news about corruption scandal involving the prime minister and only other members of the ruling party. So what they were doing was to measure the incidence of corruption or connecting the incidence of corruption to the frequency of news about corruption in these countries. Now, the limitation of this is that talking more about something doesn't mean that that something is more important. Case in point, the Partygate in the UK, right? Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson threw a party during the COVID lockdown. That was a huge scandal and ended up costing him politically very dearly, right? However, in really economic terms and social terms, it's not a very significant case. It's not very important, except only in political terms. And yet people were talking about it for weeks on end, and every day there were news about it. So this forces us to differentiate between gravity of corruption cases with frequency of discussion of corruption cases, right? Some scandals may be richer in interest, but be less significant in terms of economic damage. So because of this, our team at John Jay College, what they wanted to do is, or what we suggested is, what if we looked instead, or we converted news of corruption to cases of corruption as represented in the news? So that is exactly what we did. I won't bother you with all the detail because it had been a very lengthy process. But basically, it meant to start pretty much at the same point that the researchers at the IMF did, meaning identifying keywords, conducting a web scraping of news websites, creating a database of news potentially related to corruption based on these keywords. And then that's the point where we bifurcate, when we part, because we needed to find a way in which we would combine different news articles that related to the same case to combine into that one case. So for this, we started making use of new advances in machine learning. First, we had extracted on average about 20,000 news based on keywords from each one of 16 countries across the Americas. We have Bolivia, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Colombia, Peru, Costa Rica, Jamaica, etc., etc. Many of those news are not directly about corruption cases, because the word corruption may be just mentioned about a historical case that wasn't part of our time frame, or be mentioned in relation to something else that wasn't important to us. So what we did is we trained a model, an algorithm. We manually classified about 2,000 news of corruption to show the model how a corruption news actually reads and it looks like, so that it could automatically filter out all the other news that were noise, that mention corruption but are not about corruption. So with that, we ended up with about 4,000 to 5,000 news per country, with a level of accuracy of 88%, meaning that a large majority of those news were indeed about corruption. And then we forced, or we employed other models to force the news to categorize themselves automatically into 64 clusters. So what this model does is it tries to identify hidden themes in a group of articles and group them together based on that theme, right? So you would end up with news about corruption in Congress, corruption in courts, corruption in the Trump administration, things like this. So of course, this is not exactly what we wanted. So we forced the model, we gave higher statistical weight to terms related to human names, right? Because the model, what it does is checking different words to identify hidden things. So if you tell the model, hey, do this, but try to connect the articles based on who are mentioned in these articles, right? The rationale behind this was that the most consistent element usually connecting articles about the same corruption case is the mentioning of the suspect or the person that is being charged as being the culprit in that case, right? The Fujimori case, for example, in Peru, or the cases of corruption surrounding the Menem administration or the Kirchner administration. So there's always one person, one congressman, one minister, one public official. That gave a better result in that indeed many clusters ended up being connected to one specific individuals or one specific group of individuals that facilitated then finally the manual extraction or the manual identification of cases, on average about 50 major cases over the period between 2019 and 2021, and then the manual extraction of key information related, amounts affected, public agencies involved in the case, subnational location of the case, things of this sort. So this is ongoing. So because of this, I cannot show you results, but it's expected to come out in the report in a few months. So please watch out for that. Then as part of the John Jay project, we also looked at public procurement risk indicators that I mentioned to be part of the third generation. Just an idea of what it means. I won't show you more detail about it. This information reflects the methodology developed by Mihaly Fazekas, a Hungarian researcher working in Europe. He is the most significant expert in this area of measuring corruption. And he and his team developed a methodology that identify a series of indicators that tend to suggest high risk of corruption affecting public contracts. For example, contracts where you only identify a single bidder, right? Or where public contracts are not being advertised, or when the advertisement is only open for 5 days and do not give enough time for other companies or other people to send their proposal, right? So a lot of these indicators suggest the possibility that the bidding process has been rigged to favor someone connected to the public official, right? So using or extracting data from open data platform that most countries around the region have right now. This is a process that we have been conducting in Latin America that will allow us to find those contracts in which one or more of these indicators present a red flag, right? When international best practices have not been followed, and establish a probability of corruption taking place. Now, the problem that these type of indicators are facing effectively right now, including the efforts in Europe, is that even in the best cases, there is a large amount of crucial information that is not being included in these open data platforms. The Open Contract Partnership, which is an international NGO, focused on developing protocols and pushing for governments to be more transparent about their public processes, have identified a large number of key information, key points of information that needs to be included. But in many cases, this is just not the case. So even in Europe, there's about only 60% of all the crucial information normally being published openly. So things, for example, that as the name of the company winning the contract, specific amounts or locations, very often can be missing. So this creates an effective limitation on the use of this perfectly fine methodology. Another instrument for measuring corruption, and I believe that I'll try to finish with this one, is the usage of satellite images. The idea basically is to see if we can observe changes or difference in the way that public construction projects are being executed compared to what we expect based on contracts or on money being paid. A famous paper on this area using satellite images, I identified the correlation between the intensity of light in different parts of the country with the specific political leaders of the moment. In the case that you're seeing in front of you, it was how the region in which the former prime minister of Sri Lanka was born, right after he gained office and then became president, how very quickly that region started to prosper, right? Signaling the fact that the leadership favored his own home region, right? So favoritism has been observed through planetary observation. In the same way, we can observe that in Sao Paulo as a case study. Yeah, we extract information, we extract data using data from Sentinel-2 that provides us this multi-band from a spectrum multi-band to extract data about the same location at different points in time. What you're seeing here is from 2015 on the left side, 2021 on the right side. We use that and we run it through a software to be able to differentiate types of surface based on reflectivity or water content or vegetation or different forms of material that may give different reflections or give data at different points of the coloric spectrum to kind of be able to separate between, constructions that exist now, but in the past they were just vegetation or there was just an empty land. So with this, we can very quickly identify changes in the urban landscape between two periods of time. When we compare this with historical satellite images using Google Earth or other software, then we can easily try to identify what type of construction it was. In this specific case, we're talking about a big train station, right? So we know just looking at satellite images that there was a train station constructed in Sao Paulo between 2015 and 2021, and indeed there were cases of corruption involved in this because of time delays and over expenditure and over budgeting, etc., etc. Now, is this something that we wouldn't have been able to observe using news? Of course not, right? This appeared on the news, so just using news, we would have been able to identify this case of corruption. But news is limited because of the limitations in the content. Yes, there are just a certain amount of words that can be published every single day. There are a lot of construction going on in a lot of cities around the country. So it becomes extremely inefficient and extremely costly to try to physically observe this in person through reporters or other means, how these process of construction are undergoing at any period of time. So the idea of satellite images is to be more efficient, to reduce the cost, be able to move faster, and with good enough data, we could potentially observe things such as degradation of materials much faster than it would be expected, right? In Peru, there is the case of water processing plant that was constructed by Odebrecht in 2013, and right now is inoperative, and important parts of it are degrading very quickly. Then it was found that it was because of the materials being used and issues with budgeting, right? So this is just one example. If we can follow up how these constructions are evolving over larger periods of time, there's a lot of information about potential risk of corruption affecting those contracts that we could extract. Yes, so to finish up, this is the last instrument that I wanted to show you today. There are others, believe me, but I could continue going on forever. The point that all of these approaches point us towards is that corruption cannot be addressed in terms of measurement as the one thing. It is not one phenomenon. If we consider it one phenomenon, we must at least consider it to be a complex phenomenon. The same way that we think about societies as being complex systems, corruption is a complex phenomenon. At the very least, it is multidimensional. It has 3 dimensions. we need to consider frequency of corruption, cost of corruption, and the moral weight of corruption. An example that I normally give my students is, if you had to compare two countries, two hypothetical countries, one that experiences a lot of political corruption and another one that experiences a lot of bureaucratic corruption, but where the politically does not normally is found in scandals. Which one of these countries would you say is more corrupt? The answer is impossible, right? Because we don't know if political corruption is more important or more significant or more costly than bureaucratic corruption. And right there and then is this problem about comparing countries that appear at the top rank of the corruption perception index compared to those who are looking at illicit financial flows, right? That there are different forms of corruption and they have different meanings, both in terms of cost and the meaning that people give them based on their own social values. There's also the necessity, but thankfully also the capacity now of differentiating frequency, cost, and moral weight of corruption by sector, right? Because knowing that Chile is less corrupt than Peru or than Mexico doesn't really help policymakers in either Peru or Mexico, right? Because policies needs to be targeted, needs to have a specific focus, and knowing the level of corruption at the national level is not good enough. We need to differentiate by sector. A significant platform that has been advocating for this and making a lot of progress in this, or supporting this, I should say, is curbingcorruption.com, a platform launched by Mark Piman and Paul Haywood a few years ago that specifically addresses common causes of corruption and common types of corruption and common anti-corruption policies by sector. And luckily, this is also something that we can observe in procurement data, because all public agencies engage in public contracting. So when we establish the risk of corruption in these processes, we can separate it by sector very clearly. And we can do the same for incidents of corruption on the news. News also related to corruption in the health sector, for example, during the response to the pandemic. In many countries across Latin America, we started appearing more and more scandals related to corruption in the health sector. We can also find news of corruption in the education sector and in defense. So the news also allow us to this level of disaggregation. Then we have location. Again, at the national level is great for international comparison, but does not help policymakers. Both procurement data, news data, and other measurement instruments are able to give us very precise information at the subnational level. However, we need to also consider that many forms of corruption that are significant today do not take place, cannot be perfectly assessed either at the national or subnational level, but we need to focus on international networks. And this has been one of the reasons why Transparency International have not yet included illicit financial flows in their corruption perception index, even though they have more openly embraced the idea that this is a limitation. It is very difficult to assess how much responsibility for an international corruption case should be adjudicated to national actors, right? However, that doesn't mean that the case doesn't exist. It's just that we need to differentiate moments in which we need to assess corruption, but as international networks that cannot be divided either at even at the national level. Finally, and this is my last point, we can also differentiate by hierarchical level. Low-level corruption or bureaucratic corruption does not look the same as political corruption, does not have the same incentives, does not allow for the application of the same policy solutions. Yes, it is driven by different things. In many cases, political corruption is driven by political survival, which means that the end goal of processes of corruption or incidents of corruption is not monetary benefit per se, but rather political control, power, right? Whereas that's not the same case for bureaucratic corruption, where financial incentives are directly to be found as at the core of that phenomenon. Yes, so by differentiating incidents of corruption by hierarchical level, we are also better able to tailor our policy solutions in a way that hopefully will have better results. And this is pretty much it. A complex phenomenon, which many behavioral forms, many dimensions. So potentially in the future, looking at a piecemeal complex mapping of what corruption is and how much corruption there is in different countries, right? Okay, and this is it for me. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have now, and later on, also if you want to contact me, I'm sharing my email address here.
Thank you so much, Joseph, for this presentation and for your time taking to this to share with us your knowledge and your findings in the last years and the projects that you have been working with. Let me close with let me pose a few questions for your closure comments for the next minutes to close this session. Well, the major criticism for the use of data tools, particularly coming from social science, is the data. As you mentioned, it is like the availability of data to run these tools, to get some insights and find risks or any kind of assessment is always a challenge because of the nature of the activity, right? I mean, we're talking about corruption activity, which tend to be obscure by nature, by the activity. So one of the concurrent criticism on the use of these tools is how much is this going to help in real time to combat corruption, where our tools are being basically applied most of the times on activity of the past or the data that is available from the past, such as journalist investigations or case records or case files that have been, from cases of judgment of corruption activity, or maybe just data sets from procurement of past activity that companies did. So how is this going to be a challenge for all the academic working in corruption? And of course you lead a lot of those initiatives, so it's a question that is relevant also for you and for our audience. And the other thing is, how can we also, given that we, as you finished in your last slide, given that we already recognize that the problem with differentiating regions, and this is something that you have worked very closely because you have a big picture of all the differences between cultures, practices in context in the different regions of the world. How can we how do you foresee to include these situations in this context in the measurement? Let me give you an example. Let's say in Guatemala, there was a huge effort international effort, including to combat corruption and to combat specifically those networks that work or across the time and seizing also political power and working in an interlinked relationship. And despite the judicial reforms, despite the compliance with international standards of anti-corruption, despite of taking into the judiciary system and imprisonment of a lot of the members of those networks, leaders that have been being corrupt and contributed to the criminal activity of the country for several years. Despite of that, there are nowadays setbacks and that tell us that, that there's no, those mechanisms that were used as a state building mechanisms do not grant the long lasting results. So how can we include these long lasting objectives in combating corruption? And tell us in the last minutes, like how can you foresee the coming research in these practicalities that we mentioned here?
Thank you. Wow, those are really deep questions and very complex as well. So I will give you my 2 cents, and I'll give some information in my answer about potential ways forward and who are working on these specific points. The first one was about data quality, availability, and the capacity to use it to really change a future perspective, right? Data quality is a large problem. And we find ourselves right now at a very interesting point in time, I should say, because in the past there was not a lot of data available on the dealings of the public within the public sector. And right now what we seem to be observing in many parts of the world, if not most of the world, is kind of like that in fiction, there's always the 2 variants of authoritarianism, right? Authoritarianism that is completely secretive in their dealings, or the authoritarianism that just give you an avalanche of information, both true and fake, so that people are incapable of really realizing what's going on, right? So right now we seem to be, in terms of data, on the second one. There's so much data around. I'm not even talking just now about fake information. Just in terms of real data, there is so much that is very difficult to process it effectively and sustainably, that will allow us to monitor corruption in real time. It's very expensive to deal with big data. People usually don't realize that even though we are making huge effort in machine learning, and potentially at some point that may facilitate curation of data, until now, data science projects, 60% of it is just data processing, data collection, cleaning it, making sure that records match, focusing on the things that are important. As a point in case, the databases that are being produced by Mihaly Faseka's and their group for different countries, for Mexico, they collected about 1.3 million public contracts. It's a huge file, yeah? And they did not just extracting information from one website, but from several websites, which require that the case from one website, of course, could be also represented in another one, but with a slightly different information, because maybe this focus on variables A to M, and this one focus on F to Z, right? So they needed to be matched. Anything that was duplicated needed to be taken away, and then everything needed to be standardized. For example, the currency mentioned in many public contracts are not just in local currency, but they may be mentioned in yen, in pounds, in US dollars, in euros, etc., right? So all of these takes a significant amount of time in processing this. So normally, by the time that we finish, the data is already 1 year old. Normally, on average, right? So can we create a system that will continuously update the database by extracting new information that is being published today or tomorrow, right? And updating the analysis? That is the goal. That would be amazing. And hopefully at some point toward the end of the decade, we should have. I would be surprised if we don't. Maybe it's going to be a lot earlier than that. But there are significant obstacles to be tackled. Right now, for the least important things, we can automate them very well. But for the things that are most important, we still need people looking through it. Now, that doesn't mean that we cannot, even if we cannot follow it in real time, that we cannot predict certain trends, right? Professor Alina Mungiu-Pipidi has evolved from previous indexes of public integrity that she had been working on to her platform now, called Corruption Forecast, right? That is part of anti-corp project. Yeah, it's what they try to do is based on corruption that we have observed over several years into the past, and knowing the political context and political changes, we can see how those changes are going to impact the level of corruption moving forward 1-2 years into the future. This requires a high degree of knowledge about what causes changes, what are the causes of corruption levels in different societies, right? Now, to a certain degree, we have made a lot of progress, but on the other hand, there's more than we don't know about what causes corruption and what affects corruption levels than we think normally. And this is because a lot of the data that we have collected in the past is not really about corruption, as I mentioned earlier. It's about just bribery as one form of corruption, or it's about just the control of corruption, or is the opinion of experts about the integrity of the justice administration. So we may be in the ballpark, but it is still very delicate to forecast that what is happening right now will definitely have the effect that you think it will. Because if that was the case, then China, for example, would be democratic right now. You follow the experts from the 90s, right? No one saw how corruption was affecting the war on terror from the American side, right? And how that created a crisis in Afghanistan, and how Afghanistan now is led by the Taliban again. All of that, now we know that is very much connected to human rights abuses, but very much also connected to corruption. And for the longest time, that was not even included in policy analysis. So it's still a lot more than we need to know to understand. Now, regarding the second one about how do these political conditions that are found in Guatemala compared to the ones in Indonesia and other parts of the world affect, right, our capacity to control corruption, it is also connected to measurement of corruption. And here I think that the best work on the area that has not been properly exploited is that of Michael Johnston with syndromes of corruption. Corruption is something that had already been mentioned, right? So since the late 1980s. Corruption has a formula, but the ideal level of corruption can never be zero either, right? Because it's like crime. You cannot completely eliminate crime, because at some point the investment becomes too large and the rate of return is just too little. So it doesn't make any sense, right? So can we effectively control corruption in places where corruption is not the biggest danger to the well-being of citizens? For example, in places where the countries experience civil strife, right? Would anyone be interested really in funding anti-corruption activities in Yemen right now or in Sudan? It would be unreasonable, right? So fortunately, right now, for what I hear around, there's more and more acceptance of the fact that in many conditions, especially when countries are affected by political instability, certain forms of especially elite corruption needs to be tolerated, because international effort need to have counterparts with whom to coordinate humanitarian relief, for example. USAID has opened a specific department related to anti-corruption activities, which is a huge progress. And on an interview that she gave a few months ago, the director was pointing out the fact that they need to work with whoever is in charge in those countries, regardless of if people consider them to be corrupt. At some point, yes, it's going to be good to start introducing anti-corruption activities that give some relief to the life of citizens, but to be properly successful, as some scholars working with a global integrity, Professor Khan, for example, they suggest that there needs to, especially in those locations, policy proposals need not affect the ruling elite in order to effectively reduce corruption and provide relief to citizens, specifically if we talk about the reduction of administrative or bureaucratic corruption, right? So this only happens if we can see corruption as a multidimensional phenomenon. And if we conduct, administer instruments that are able to tell us exactly what sectors we can kind of manage or intervene in without affecting our political coalition. Because at the end of the day, if we don't have political will for anti-corruption, we won't succeed, right?
Right.
So hopefully that will provide an answer.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Joseph, for taking the time and being with us in this session. And thank you everyone for connecting, for getting stay connected in this session. I would like just to say special thanks to Ana Oropesa at ILAS in Columbia University and Fernando Santillán at the Legal Research Institute and Hector Zavala in Boston. Thank you for supporting this event and providing your advices too. And please stay tuned for the next sessions of the seminar session. Thank you. Have a wonderful day, Joseph, in Japan, and have a wonderful night, everyone else in the other side of the world. Thank you so much.
Thank you.